Hello, this is the African teacher, Morris Odhiambo, here in Nairobi, Kenya. When I was studying political philosophy under great scholars like Professor Muga Kolale in the early 1990s in Egerton University, I never thought that imperialism as a framework of analyzing international relations would be so much more important today than it was 40, 50 years ago. You have heard how American policymakers are praising empire. What empire basically means is imperialist expansion. As Africans, we saw that during slavery, we saw that during colonization, and we continue to see that under the neo-colonialist umbrella. Scholars have talked about imperialism. Karl Marx looked at imperialism as a necessary expansionist phase of capitalism, driven by the constant need for new markets, raw materials, higher profits, and so on and so forth. And Johann Galtung, or Galtung, whichever way you want to pronounce that, developed the theory of structural imperialism. And he argued that global inequality is maintained not just by direct force, but through a structural, often invisible system that connects the center and the periphery. The center is, in this case, is the dominant nations and the dominant elites, while the periphery is the dominated nations and the dominated elites. Let's read from Kwame Nkrumah, Neocolonialism, The Last Stage of Imperialism, a book that should be a must-read for every African everywhere in this world. This is what Kwame Nkrumah had to say. The neocolonialism of today represents imperialism in its final and perhaps its most dangerous stage. In the past, it was possible to convert a country upon which a neocolonial regime had been imposed, and he gives the example of Egypt in the 19th century, a good example of that, into a colonial territory. Today, this process is no longer feasible. Old-fashioned colonialism is by no means entirely abolished. It still constitutes an African problem, but it is everywhere on the retreat. This, of course, he was writing in the early 1960s. Once a territory has become nominally independent, it is no longer possible, as it was in the last century, to reverse the process. Existing colonies may linger on, but no new colonies will be created. In place of colonialism as the main instrument of imperialism, we have today neocolonialism. Hence the title of this book, Neocolonialism, The Last Stage of Imperialism. When you listen to Western policymakers praise empire, when you listen to them talk about how they will conquer and colonize Cuba, how they will conquer and colonize Venezuela, how they will beat up Iran and reverse the Islamic revolution, of course, which reminds you of how they killed millions in Iraq, how they killed millions in Syria, how they destroyed Libya. When you listen to all that rhetoric, the question is, was Kwame Nkrumah right when he said that the conquer of physical territory was on a retreat? Maybe it was on a retreat then, but maybe, just maybe, it could be making a comeback as we see the big powers basically deal or refuse to deal with the internal contradictions that have been caused by their bombing other countries, their enslaving other civilizations, they are taking over other people's territories. I've been seeing this very interesting video where this person raises the question. So one person says, why can't the Muslims just stay in their own lands? And then the response is, oh, well, you know that we are bombing them, so they cannot stay where we are bombing. Now, the current conversations to me are extremely interesting, especially when you see what happened to Venezuela and when you see the bombing that was done in Nigeria, when you see the sabotage right now going on in terms of bringing back Niger, Burkina Faso, and so on back to the French fold. So are we in fact going back in history? These are things that as an African, you must understand. You must try to figure out what is going on. Will Africans continue to maintain this thin independence? Will Africans get actual independence where their economies are not controlled by the West? Or what is going on? Let's discuss these issues. They are extremely important.